our reset agenda. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African.
Africa for say,
In January, I was sworn in for a second term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly.
Yes, some for you now kwaba ebium emra jumadi asia tenasia and sama ekoso ewo oman Ghana mu as usual. Yede ni nyina ebre for president His Excellency John Mahama wakopiem ewo US na after set UN meeting no ba wie ya mampani John Mahama eri sembebre etu dwa no enkomo bebre so de frechi eba Ghana for and after the whole of Africa obia ebo mampani abaso ewo na kokudura onya ede ekasa ye quick one abusua emrofo kwa na shoki wo mu yankuni nya butrenti samua His Excellency John Mahama ekaya jese akofan sembebre aba na ekoba infomio ha commander ede ni nyina ebana fe no abigije ensoso ewramaransa na no commander yenya botre na yenya konya
of course
ni nti mampani nsem no na minimisi ekoba yebetutu no wanwa na fe no ye bie because 24-hour economy no epiemu ho quick one abusha yenya botre ntimra.
At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating, faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens. My new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy. And our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we're progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, no, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on. In today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real, and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, "The United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general and the Security Council in particular." I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, "We seek to be friends with all and enemies to none." The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you'll find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Warsan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell it slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property, in quotes, and that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her briefing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, Commander.
Yeah, Director.
His Excellency John Mahama.
Yeah.
And Ghana for any Africa. Obia e bomb penia baso. Ewa kukudra wanya dia kasa.
Yeah.
Among force we any president. When your friend is a president.
Yeah.
Because I'm say our confidence.
Okay.
On so for no.
Okay.
But quick one you run him.
Well, Director, in the first place, but me know what.
Oh.
Na me charge for. But answer na me dim in common. I have first me miss out say. I fro kunu. What the hell?
Oh, sir, I don't know what say I who said me banadwuma ye. Mania bre.
What jai fro you know.
Mania bre sa problem. Oh, say I front the nyanye ye.
Say you say you woman no.
Oh, there be eno na kake. Na I don't do. But ye nyanye ne de osem be ye adwuma.
Wa, but ye.
Many kaka say dey na kwa ye be no. Na nyumre me ba be ye adwuma.
Okay.
And say makoda me yire nchen.
Emre na be kire but as it stands. I fro ni gina mu.
Enti mo pa me nkoda na.
Ye vie show ya. Say wadwuma ba hwiye.
Mate.
Iti dia ye ne se
so who na se wadwuma ba hwiye o. Ba me fro no me ba betena ha. So what you are Julian Fanisa.
Finally, I from the last day.
Oh,
and never one. The right about Nancy Bima, not Oya if you could be
and Casa Mario for Ubonsa, Adia Bechano. One mamma, brighter media member.
Okay, yeah, Baba.
Mr. Dana, may I from Kwameba, Commander,
but and then a final day, who say, at your phone, a lot of donations, but a car last day, yeah. When you said penny for you, almost so young last day, last day, yeah, and last day, no, I was your bomb, I said, and then a catwalk, okay, and never one, a right for Dana Casam, okay, it's in a year, can find a donation, mobile money number, the producer, that was my idea, right to you, okay, last hour, last days are dangerous, one said. Obi didi mo tu na odi ahwe
panyan na dam
sem na no
fakoyo yire ho ade
no wa fa bibia
omoya ade
fa bibia
na brighter media ahefo mo abrochie mo Ghana de mo ye no me kasa me kan de bechi
of course
me kasa me ko mistake pa bodi a commander
yeah
one sha asembesi
ma bo pepe
but an ye program na maseda nyina beba tiba quick one commander mampani se me yeni hu nkomo na fa big jemrem
well
any primary
Roger on this issue ma me hyasia na yentretrem na yeni nkomo yie
yeah
Roger we eye UN omo general meeting na omo ye no afi bia e na e course e United States US memo but mampani nkomo kodi yin are getting a lot of attention because of nsema okaye any eniema oka ho asem no ama enei across the world obi abo mampani dia ye bo na baso enya Ghana fo a mampani appear free UN assembly meeting aseno na omo de placards akogina bonten e boje mampani so say de mampani aye omo hu bi da e wata woni mampani komo ma chichem kakra chichem
na mampani du ba bi no o se o kan kese se de be omo mo teacher no meti
mo de wata ma me fan free ho
e ho na mu se ne ni abere
ma me fan free ho de wata mampani komo no wa twema adwen akosi bibi so se reset agenda na okan wo Ghana no enye Ghana nko a na wo hu se baby a ewiase kono se ya reset oman no na ya nsi kwan ne so a wan hwa ye bayira we have to head towards the right direction said ye baya ewiase ni nkodu stage bi no na Ghana ye ho dada de wata baby a wo de mi efri ye no ho na mi gina mampani sei o ka ba wiase nyina te say we cannot develop the world cannot go forward without Africa and they so you be usua dia according to President John Mahama adia wasua abrofo no nyina gituma statistics and predictions can say in the next 50 years Africa ene be kitawiase because ahana the young population of what dey omo ye adwuma omo nyina ebe busy in Africa and what 1/4 of the world's population, meaning 25% of the world population, ever basic in Africa, and you cannot develop the world without Africa. South Africa, anywhere, we are seeing in the coming years. The mampani kai no, and or say can it be no more material no, obia to say. Yes, see, Africa anywhere, we are seeing BM.
And so I'm from here.
What a winning.
And the mampani okay.
Not a problem in here. Na do nya opportunity for UN assembly meeting as say or address the whole wiase na obi etie no na do asem akokai ni say Burkina mampani Ibrahim Traore akofa Russia fo Wagner group e de abagu Ghana and Russia border so ene omo haye into US mampani ni UN ene Burkina mampani nkasa na won yi omo mfiri ho this was the message akosele na nye ono nko Africa mampani fo no committee a oba no mkuta graphic no ma biem omo kan ya no mada a lot of issues because meeting na no ene me ko hu so obi comment o sanana do ne ko ya kwa dada on kan po say he needs to start thinking say in the next coming years in the future generations again you bet my ya be match up with abrofo no right abrofo ne nipa e toda wo hwe nanim e ka no kra kire na ene nsem bia obeka no they will start feeling say enkrofo is so many ate they've waked up from their dreams Diasona na yeso emre bia omo control broso no ase omo free dayenim until we cannot control them anymore yani omo kware pepepe e wata mampani kasa no say ewi ase tumi a ye de ahye UN nsem ya omo na omo security council e dictate we ase nyina ye bambo no right Africa you need just one slot mpo e di we ase nyina se kwan ye bofa so a ye bobo we ase ho ban no ye kwadwene ho a bibini nka ho nti dia na kire se ewi ase ni bibini ka ho be this was a questioner mampani bu say UN president any ewi ase mampani fu akosia ho nyina obi say obi at ho dia fedie and somebody this because they feel like he is speaking for the real Africans when na kire se Kwame Nkrumah ne Nelson Mandela Africa na omo chekire no this is the way na e was echo say the WBG canon no mampani John Romani ha wa manensi ho rota ahana e me final stage a komoni me te mampani ko ye no wo hu say aman panifo wiase nyina ba aside ye ka ye problems no emfaso ben ene ye be search manya e de free meeting na ekwen because ye twa plane ticket na akọ ya boka ya kwada hotel enti ye nyam faso bi mfrim ye mfa bo baako enku no mamie no mampani ko no say me mampani John Dramani Mahama me ya 24-hour economy e wo krom me pese you run it 3 shifts a day ye adwuma 247 and wachi me ya reset agenda the platform mampaninya wo US ho no ewiase ebi ni ba bia say on one stage not big media houses or my bia national TV station e capture sa event no ebi si biem e UN general meeting say and abehu and as World Cup asa in this case some mampani nya opportunity na okoka wo ya business personalities ahodo any companies we wiase a omo pe baabia e safe baabia benya confidence in the government no mako invest e wo man no they will start running to Ghana omo nyina betum recover because mampani asell your project no e dem out right
and say e be attract investors
of course because who say mampani e din akọ Japan ni Singapore pay investors
and all kasa no kwa no 24-hour economy ni betomu
yeah the right odi nkomo na e hokra na me bay the right according to mampani no 24-hour economy no e the game changer yeah odi nkomo da bia it is when your opportunity ubetiwa call for investors this is the best opportunity we no yemfa ni agro
and osanso kasafa I see the one
of course
exchange rate inflation
of course
and no mampani fasa kwano so aton man Ghana
right seven nyina no so hwe ya mampani komu no kodie no or address issues ni wie no mampani had another agenda say mami ko sell Ghana to the world e wiase nyina etie ntet sadia mami project Ghana interior nyina say ene ahana Ghana dina ntu ye businessman mampani aka tro say the best 24-hour economy, which yenye bida e krom ho inti esuti businessmen any investors. But we are no catch say me currency no I very stable ahode ban because emre bi atwam na currency ni ahode inti investor ni won say ampa so man sika sam na gina na mampani ni kase oye 24-hour economy dia ene me kokwa business na menya sika can ending to form na bi ntimenya bibi papa esa dia ba mi krom right this are simple things here a communication technique you can make sure say only just 1 minute you talk to millions of people we are say they understand and they will come no matter be invest right mampani wa kire say o communicator but adia ba ko pe na machine e woni nsemi nyina mu but he is very bold mampani oyobi a ne kokodru oni agrosa die woni tirim say wait na me pesa me ye no ene no obeye enya wo dia oka na otie because right mampani komo ya these are certain things here has been talking about it e Ghana ha enim say e joke sa enye joke o dia dru suro ho the right wa critic
ya baba na baso
akọ friend is saying Gaza and Israel everywhere ya mana baso he has done very well and he say e dem fa so papa e bebeba
oh my Ghana mu yemfansia na yema bigi jensom ram na onfa kakra bi emesoso na yenko abigi tena semami na boko de
manyame adu me ho de papa
what a quick one mampani akopiem ewo UN meeting ase wakotuja ama obia ebona baso quick one yeni hu nkomai
sina mama mencha hwefo na maba president Mahama so mama mbla wo ho na ane upediewa
ene me pediewa na obeto nsumi ye dewa
anane ankasa aye wedding day na aye we awo se wotena se ji wa homi woti ha woti ha
enu kwa na o se mo ba no se me no me fama dwuma ni agro
o se o minim se wa dwuma de o fa ndi agro na so adwuma o kan osankafo a o se bibia wo ne mene emre bi wo ha
ene mama nsori nko
asa wanya tena se wi
mama nsori nko
wanya tena se
gamako
na se watena tie wo se watena se wo se
yebe untie na
emasa
yebe untie na
davi mama ncha mama mbo ahwesu fo abaso omo ye ade a asoye nipa na mo aka 3 minutes
akade
3 minutes na o ma mo de o ma chede aban se emfa ma de brata no nyankopon se wa wo fa o de mai aka 3 minutes fa o de bra na ye trase ye betrase ye bobo abaso ni aka de waye enti 3 minutes na ke aye ania message de brata po ompo every samble ko ye ntwa video ye ntrase
ye betwa
na wo ye ready
ye betwa ye fie de ni wi a ye beba betwa wedding day no kwa no e o sie twa Die twa Sunday no kwa de se ne na teta.
For a team on sound, I was check out no sound mattress.
Me free hotel.
I mean, Jindy said I have 4 because oh, Mamma, man, problem.
It is a man, what? Me flow no ama.
I, Mimma. Because I don't know you need judging. Masada above 4 bush say.
About Jenna.
Above 4 boy over Trassi. I have a brown with a one. I done it. Now, Papa Bina. Last me wali. Autia me hotel.
Mr. Santi.
Mr. Santi.
What you hotel nika.
Hey, Yamishiran. Unim. Otia hotel se kapet. Na sem dia chire. Wo de sasem na me dia shada kum.
Baba. Oni na di hom.
Me nobody hom kom. Anti the brother what you ama wo no.
Yeah.
Asante aye. Wa wo fa ode mbae. Me sere wada Roma. Fa ode bra. Na yenko. Sinaba yenko President Mahama.
Akopie mu UN meeting asema wakotuja o yenko e.
Na onim.
Dabi.
Ghana for to aban. O man boka.
Are.
Na obanya o man pani a wakotina UN meeting ase. A wo tutu bom say man emma mbrofo no. Aye nanado a ontimi. A president former president Anadwa onkasa
say
ontimi ntubom we.
Oh David.
Na Mahama boshe wo she Ghana fo no. Enu na oji se oye. Hwe papa we nima wo ye no eye nsanchireni awa BC ta. No Nanado da be no akota UN minti. Otina 8 years. Wo se wakasa say da. Aye president Mahama wo hena kuma so a opeso oman tumpon UN for meeting o mo fra meeting okwa onyam faso bia mfiriso ene wototo bompa ama aye Nanado oba o dai bosia me kwa me kan bosia o mo fa mame Mahama say mo mpe ane matoto bompa ama mo anti mo batena se mo manen favor Africa fo mo man favor Ghana fo mo nkwa mrof no nkwa na enfavor mo anti president Mahama ade a wo ye me say BC ta Sinama wo se meboa.
Na true.
Every see that. Yeti ha yeti Ghana yo yenhwe man ni mu. Mahama de o okototo anema ansama okeken. Eso wo mfaso pa abama o man dache. Sem brofo no behu sa President Mahama de so oba ya fremiti no oba ya nye enema yi a. Oba onfa nche. Anto mbatoto oba mu nyina batoto mu nema. Enti de papa yi ayen sanchireni a BC wo Ghana ha. Aw mampeni kwa watimi akwa kansam we bebrebe ensem woken eso asuba aba enti medebia meka mesese me na me Ghana ka hye motum se yesi preyanko to aba ema Mahama nkota etema meto aba no ayesa because o manpe bia no open faso afri se o mampeni bi ba obanya faso afri me de o mampeni a wabe wai manyam faso bebre ba kunie ayo ros yateso pai cement yateso anema bebre yateso when enya we ya ompe yede yankase ankofo bia na o mo asolo no na dollar adwane san wo ma dollar abafo anam mo awokoto 6 million ne wotimi to mo 3 million
ana o ka 24 economy ho asem
papa maminka my way papa we on wo vision ankasa
na onzuro onzuro sa bia na brof no bofu
mo bofu ho
Ghana
na mrofo mfaso omunya firi Ghana ha on sa na anya nkomo omo pa omo bufu ye ade omunya firi ha ya godi nyina nya omo ho ya godi omo pa omo bufu ne yeso ya mfa ya godi na yenka no kre Africa for say mrofo ya fi o ma akomo ndi ada
za
na ade akomo ndi ada 24 economy President Mahama ekan o betuma di bia wura ku adwuma na diane bu o man na aduane bu a hon na ha ho o fa sika akotwa bode a wabedi anti akomande ha papa we ade ha na nsa me hwe video bi papa bi se MPO okopie sante chama agogo sesai okopie ndosi gudom se a April ano sre President Mahama and 1 hour 1 hour nuna President Mahama say mungi sika na domfo na omugu dom ho
mekai pa
muni ma pro mo sesanko na mo sika nkoto open ko form brew ablabom pa eden pa yakuyafo oba bre adade no onya oba wie na asase anti President Mahama yewe ya Una kuyania otifia na una na nka otisa wo se Mahama nyabe no na otisa sane me wanye bida o peso enema pro as pre Mahama say there be me manem pro meji na sa kuyafo we ade anya bia to no manya bia hwemma na masande ahwemma mediama school fo sa anya mfaso afis na sa bo oman no ade oman pani ba nya ayesi mumisa na do waye bida na do person ya don't choose na do person ya ndo jeni na bebre epro otime husade no anti pre Mahama anema oye na ebi sita ebi sunsita ayo hoy biem anti president Mahama anema wa 24 economy aye we ya eni bebia kuyani no wa bre 24 economy o de wana wa baba totua ka o masante aye 24 economy ebi o mama bon ne ka se enye 24 o ma bon tira omunim ya nkomo ye de dada ka sa nem apro de dada nkomo di warehouse ka so aba mfasto ma o man ane sa nem akogu warehouse eba bua ma school fo nya enema omum krabiem we ye krabiem we Ghana for we 24 economy entosi 24 economy jeni 24 economy moko aba nti wo mpe we ope hwan nti wo na wo se wo tena konya no so a wo se unim nyansa what na 8 years one man 24 economy amakuafo ane akuani bia beto ha opa akosoro beto aba Mahama
okay
ko ade awaye sinamai yemfasi sina wana no moni ajama
ebre ya bo mabre
wedding we started wedding there we don't pay no I intend to catch us we are da na
me kan kure mabre
Antiam catches Antiam catches a woman for shame.
Mate.
Aduma no. Sada Nadichi. We are the one who read them saying, which are Mamma Nana. Mate. Swaba my wati. Yet one of my. See now, first one may I didn't mean you be that. You be that. So, imagine where me say me binu sa kwan me faso a me ye ade no we dey minya bida we virgin minya bida Ghana virgin the get up sura bofu quick one ya kai fo yina